Hey everyone, Dave Makes Stuff. This is the first video I am putting out on YouTube. I decided to actually record at least 75% of what I made here. This is the dubstep gun from Saints Row 4, which is an older game at the time of this video, and I brought this to one convention thinking nobody would know what the heck was going on or what this even was, but I actually got a lot of positive comments about the gun, and most knew what it was. The one thing I would have changed is I would have made this a lot lighter than I actually made it. This is a very heavy prop. It's made almost entirely of styrene plastic. I used 1/8 inch for most of the framing and everything going vertically throughout the gun. The body panels themselves and everything else are 16th inch styrene. I modeled a lot of the parts off of stuff I had lying around to make sure that they fit in my hands and such, you know. Gun grips for actual gun grips so that I could hold this, and based the entire model itself off of two 8-inch speaker rings made out of MDF that I had lying around in an Amazon box. I don't actually remember what I bought them for in the first place. Luckily though, they wound up being a really good size and it made the gun really well scaled. The only thing I had to go off of really was the comparison of the character in game and their head compared to the size of the record that's on the size of the gun. And rolling off of those two rings, I was able to base the rest of this blueprint on those entirely. Once I had the basic shape of the gun all laid out, I cut it into parts and laid it out on the 16th inch styrene and started cutting up this side. I also laid out some of the basic framework I'd use on some of the other drawings themselves. I wound up not putting a lot of the framework in that I wanted to because I wanted to retain at least a little bit of lightness in this build. It didn't work at all, and this gun was really heavy carrying around the convention floor. At one point I actually had to drop it and leave it down on the ground. I just couldn't carry it anymore, and towards the end of the day people were asking for pictures and I found myself not really able to lift it anymore. And you'd think being maybe, I don't know, 8 pounds, it wouldn't be that bad, but hauling it around the entire day, it takes a toll. I made sure to put in a lot of pass-throughs for all the wiring I'd eventually do. I used some really cobbled together wiring in this build since this is only something I intended to keep for myself and not necessarily something I needed to teach somebody else to use. Right here you see me cutting out a square for the equalizer using a trick that I saw on one of Adam Savage's tested videos of. Luckily styrene's incredibly easy to work with and gives off a nice rigid hard-lined finish for something that's supposed to be as mechanical as this gun. You can get through a lot of material really quickly and assembly really quickly just by using Weldon 3, which is what I used in this video. And this is the third styrene project I'd ever done. The very first one I built a life-size chopper droid from Star Wars Rebels and had no idea that the Weldon 3 even existed, so I was going through that entire build doing contact cement, hot glue, E6000, and a lot of other wasted effort when you can use Weldon 3, which literally welds the entire thing together as if it's one piece. It's very stable and very strong. One of the other things I didn't learn till slightly after this build was that heating the styrene made it incredibly easier to bend. So during this I used a lot of force, clamping, tape, and another bit of wasted effort trying to get these pieces to line up when a little bit of heat would have done it just fine. One of the things I was also being conscious about was that I needed to leave a lot of space open if I was to use any of the Weldon 3 inside the gun to attach the supports to the other faces that I was putting on the gun itself. This back part of the gun that mounts over your shoulder, I really could have spent a little more time molding to my actual shoulder or deepening that cut, but I was more interested in trying to get it to look like the one in the game rather than be functional. I really never intended to actually carry this around or use it. It was mostly something I just wanted to build for myself, but then after a while it kind of evolved into something I wanted to make actually function. I wanted lights, I wanted sound, I wanted it all. And I wanted it to be portable and work without being plugged in or anything like that. Here you see a lot more extra effort trying to get a piece of styrene to line up around an 8-inch MDF speaker ring. Even though this turned out, there were, better ways to go about this, such as using heat or possibly molding this out of something else entirely that was already an 8-inch diameter circle. This rectangle's entire purpose is just to be able to pass wires through the inside of the gun out to the next set. I wound up not really using it for very much besides the equalizer lights in the back of the gun, but it was still nice having a bit of space to run some wire. Right here, broke out the contact cement to try and get this piece of styrene to hook up to these rings. It did work. It took 2 or 3 coats of this contact cement to get something that really bonded. The MDF itself probably would have bonded to just about anything with the contact cement. It's really porous and holds to things really nicely, but styrene, not so much. Again, just a whole bunch of recoding, trying to get this thing to stick. I didn't want to attempt this more than once because I only had the 2 speaker rings and I had no intent of ordering another set. So I wanted this to be good from the first go. Right here, broke out the speaker that I ordered from Amazon. It's a 4-inch speaker and it weighs a lot. There was a huge magnet on it, and the second I mounted it in the gun, the whole thing dropped right over my shoulder, and I knew it was going to be a heavy thing to haul around, but it sounded really good. The one thing I would do differently is I need to add an amplifier into this. When testing this gun around my house, it sounds really loud, but the second I pulled it out on the convention floor, it was drowned out by people talking. The volume was all the way up, and it was like it wasn't even on at most times. Again, more forcing a shape into this stuff by using tape, clamps, and other methods of barbarism. Once I had the basic shape in the 8-inch rings, I used the Weldon 3 to attach the sides of the back half of the gun to the ring itself. Used hot glue for reinforcement. I just really didn't want that ring to pop apart. It hasn't, but I don't know if the hot glue was really necessary or not. Got a little frustrated with the knife and started clipping it to fit. I figured I'm using body filler at the end of this anyway, why not make it a little rough if I have to. It was really better if this ring itself fit as opposed to looking pretty. I wanted it to go together nicely. More struggling with adhesives, trying to get this ring to stay together. About right now is when I discovered it totally fits, but I had to get it to line up and make sure I could glue this together with this Weldon 3. Used a blue Sharpie throughout most of this. It showed up really well on that white styrene. Black pen works really good. Sharpie works good too, but once you start using that Weldon 3, that Sharpie bleeds all over the entire project. Little off camera here, but I was just clamping it together by hand and mashing it down on the desk while applying that Weldon 3. Again, this is something I never intended to record from the start, but I thought somebody'd find it interesting, and it was a lot of fun to put together, so didn't necessarily have the best camera setup. Right here is starting the front portion of the gun, much smaller than the back. Again, this is just traced onto some 16th inch styrene, which cuts really easy with a knife. All you have to do is score it one time, sometimes twice if you're cutting through the 1/8, and then just break it off. Tracing the same shape onto the other side to make the back half. Right here I was cutting out my rectangle, which I was going to use to install the MP3 playing board through the side and be able to access it that way. I could have put it in the main body of the gun. I wound up having a lot of room inside that disc, but I didn't know that at the time, so I set this up anyway. I used an MP3 board set up to an entirely different switch on the front portion of the gun, and that was mostly due to a time constraint and me not being able to figure out the Arduino MP3 board itself. But now I've gone back and learned how to operate those and program them. So I'm going back into this gun, removing the front trigger, and making the entire thing operate off of one trigger pull on the main handle. One of the bad things is that I did not actually record a lot of the wiring or assembling of the Arduino or any of the hardware inside the gun. I'm not sure where that all went, or if I was even recording it at all. Right here is just adding more of that 1/8 inch base material, which served as the framework for the gun. Some of this stuff I had to go back in later and actually carve out. Some of the framework actually got in the way of me attaching the speaker assembly to the front of the gun, and I wish I had planned a little better in my blueprint of how I was going to attach this, but I also didn't know the speaker itself was going to be so heavy. I had originally planned to run PVC pipe in there, and that plan got scrapped once I loaded that speaker in and saw just how heavy it was. Some of this framework also proved to be a little bit unnecessary. I went a little overboard, but I wanted to use up all the 1/8" styrene I bought. I actually had Tap Plastics cut off the entire run for me at 3 inches and designed the entire gun mostly based off of that width. Seemed okay. I probably would have done alright making the entire thing 2 inches wide. It would have looked more like the in-game model, which was more narrow than this, but it still turned out. Throughout this bit, I had a little bit of helping hands. I know it's a bit of lost footage, but once I had the front of this done, I put the speaker assembly itself together, and that was the main portion of the gun, all said and done. Here I started putting on a little bit of body filler and doing some details like 2 straps that looked like they were part of the in-game model on the top of the gun. I made a lot of use of this see-through grid ruler. It's actually become one of my more favorite tools for doing this kind of thing. I used some fiberglass body filler that you can see on the front there. While heavy, it was incredibly effective at sealing all my mistakes. Weld-On 3 starts dissolving in air. What you see here is my attempt at keeping the stuff from dissolving when I left the can open by placing a piece of bubble wrap over it, which had no effect whatsoever. The material itself dissolved in a couple days regardless. Couple passes of spot glazing putty by Bondo, which has become a favorite of mine. It dries pretty quick as long as you lay it out really thin. I used a leftover piece of styrene cut off in a real hard edge to spread it out. I also used it to seal up the MDF porousness on the side there so that when I sprayed this entire thing white it wouldn't show up too much. I wasn't overly concerned with making a very video game accurate paint job. I kind of wanted this to be more a real world weapon with weathering and more detail. So even though this didn't make it completely smooth, I got kind of bored of filling after a while and at a certain point said, this is good enough. If this was a piece for somebody else or if I was selling it, I would have entirely went to town filling in every little imperfection, sanding the styrene off and everything. But since it was just for me and I wanted to be done, speed was the key. Right here I started laying out one of the equalizer pieces that I printed out. I tried to not 3D print very many things for this build. I don't necessarily like it as a modeling or prop making tool, except for things that need weird details or if it's an overly complicated small part. Other things I prefer to make out of real world objects and found hardware. I put some glass window tint on the inside of it and real analog paint job here where I just painted a black equalizer shape on the back. Speedy quick, not much wiring besides setting an Arduino up to flash an LED in this location, and that was it. Found some nice brass rod at the hardware store which served as the speaker guards that were on the in-game model. Those weren't brass, they were more gray, but I decided the brass actually looked kind of cool, so I weathered it up and left it alone as is. Again, not the greatest camera work, but for my future videos I've worked on it an awful lot. I just went for a real basic stair-shaped design here and made it as random as I could possibly think of. Later on I went back in and put in some horizontal graphic work across the back. Right here, these are Old Faithful, the googly eyes that I took outside and laid a coat of graphite gray over. I then super glued them all in various points around to match the in-game model. These on the model itself looked like they might have been white, but I wanted them to stand out a little more and look more like a rivet or something off the side of an instrument case. Right there's a brief shot of the Arduino Uno board and the assembly it mounted to for my chassis. Inside that cavity there is the same spot I put the two battery packs. One runs the MP3 board and the other one runs the Arduino, and that's it. One needed to be 9 volts and the other needed to be 3, so to simplify that I just ran 2 separate batteries to each device. Right here is the 3D printed handle I made. I drew it up in Tinkercad, made enough space to put the wire through and a simple switch. Just a momentary trigger on the face of it that you push in, which activated all the lights. I wanted this to be really secure, so not only does it glue to the body of the gun, but I put 4 screws in the sides of the handles on both this handle and the foregrip. The handle itself held incredibly well. I had no worries whatsoever of it falling apart. I carried this around at a convention for probably 8 hours or more, and nothing happened to it. These were some 3D prints I made that held the instrument cables. I thought, what better thing to look like instrument cables for the side of this than actual instrument cables. What wound up being a pain was finding some that didn't have 90-degree ends on them. I thought those were going to be more common, but I guess not. I needed them to have straight cut ends on each side, and I had to order 3 different cables from 3 different companies just to get that to happen. I got one to start with, and that's why that was the only one in that part of the video. Another 3D printed part I designed that holds 3 5mm LEDs on the front, and even though it would have been cool to have the record spin and all of that in the interest of ease, I decided it should remain stationary, and the record itself is really exaggerated with really deep ridges and looks mostly fake in the game model, so I wanted that to stand out here. Another little bit of horrible camera work, and that is the introductory sequence of how the graphic equalizer, in quotes, was run. These are the 2 knobs that I 3D printed for each side, and each one has a set of LED strip lights, which had adhesive on the back, which I just tucked into an outside portion and glued down to the body and ran the wiring down out through the holes into the main gun. The very same strip lights you might be able to see around the face of the record there. All of these light up at the same time whenever they flash. I found some really neat replacement stereo knobs, which you see up in the top there. This was the viewfinder, or the sight, that goes on the back side of the gun, or the least interesting side of it, as I wound up having. I didn't want it to be bland, since the other side of the gun has so many lights and interesting things going on. So I decided to go ahead and try and put another graphic equalizer into this viewfinder, and that worked out really well. I ordered some violet colored lights for this one instead, and wired it up and painted the plexiglass in much the same way to make it look like an equalizer without wiring in too many LEDs. This part also served as the battery cover to cover up all of my electronics, and has 10 screws in it. Here I am putting together a really simple needle arm. This part I'll eventually replace, but I went ahead and glued together, used zip ties, and it looks a little rough around the edges, but it still did its job. Once I had that all done, I went ahead and started running some sketches, and finally came upon one that I liked, that flashed things the way I wanted. Rather than go into a music sequence, I made it random enough that it seems like it's going to the beat of the music.